Quite contrary to what Harrison Storms wanted us to believe, North American Aviation was very well aware what pressure NASA was using, and they were equally aware of the fire risk, as was NASA.
Once you get something burning in oxygen, everything will burn, including steel, including asbestos. They did 4 tests, NASA, before they got into this shit. And each test turned into a disaster. In one of the tests, a guy was changing a damn light bulb. And this is at only 5 pounds pressure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pure oxygen atmosphere, 5 pounds. Somehow the bulb broke, the spark happened, nobody knows. His arm, not his clothes, his arm caught on fire. Some guy comes racing over with an asbestos blanket, wraps the arm in it, and the asbestos blanket went on fire.
This was reported in the New York Times, 4 days after the fire.
A space agency study 3 years ago pointed out the dangers of using pure oxygen in spacecraft, but concluded that the relative simplicity of such a system made it acceptable. This became known tonight through a National Aeronautics and Space Administration study ordered in 1964. The deaths of 3 astronauts last Friday at Cape Kennedy were attributed to a fire in a spacecraft pressurized with 100% oxygen. The 1964 analysis noted that several fire accidents had occurred in space cabins using oxygen, and that some had resulted in serious injuries. The space agency says it had no space fires in its lunar program until the fatal one Friday. However, the report details 3 previous accidents in military research programs, 2 at the Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, and 1 at the Philadelphia Navy Air Center. 4 men were critically burned in the Philadelphia fire in 1962. In an oxygen-rich atmosphere, fire burns much more fiercely than when other gases are present. The study described a fire accident in an oxygen chamber at Philadelphia in which 4 men were burned critically, and a similar accident in a space cabin simulator at Brooks, where 2 men were overcome. It also mentions an earlier space cabin fire threat that was averted so readily it gave experimenters a false sense of security. This apparently also occurred at Brooks. The report said that these and other fire accidents of the kind that had occurred illustrate in concrete fashion the potential dangers of 100% oxygen atmospheres.
This NASA report was filed in 1964, the same year Handel's article was released. A year later, another fire, this time in Washington, D.C., further cemented the dangers of pure oxygen. Erland A. Cannon and Edmund H. Harvey Jr. wrote about this fire on page 344 of their book, Mission to the Moon. A fire occurred in a decompression chamber of the Navy's Experimental Diving Unit at Washington, D.C. on February 16, 1965. Conditions at the time of the fire were 28% oxygen, 36% nitrogen, and 36% helium at a total pressure of 55.6 psi, 92-foot depth, or an oxygen partial pressure at 15.6 psi. About 11 minutes after entering the chamber via a lock from an adjacent chamber at 126 psi, 250-foot depth, one of the divers reported a fire. 2 observers at a viewing port observed fire 4 inches in diameter and 2 feet high coming from the CO2 scrubber immediately prior to a flash fire that engulfed the entire chamber. During the next minute, chamber pressure rose to 130 psi, 260-foot depth. Attempts to rescue were unsuccessful, and both occupants died. Both NASA and North American Aviation knew very well that pure oxygen posed a tremendous fire risk. Both had known since 1964. At that time, Gordon Cooper had concluded the Mercury project with his flight aboard Faith 7. If a fire had broken out during a Mercury flight, an astronaut could easily have solved the problem by blowing the hatch. And on Gemini, both astronauts had ejection seats. But Apollo had no such escape measures. As Frank Borman writes when discussing his testimony to Congress,
Why couldn't the astronauts have escaped? I explained that the Apollo command module had only a plug-type door. Under pressurization, it sealed tight and couldn't be opened except from the outside.
To verify Borman's claims, I searched the transcripts available from the Accident Investigation Report issued by the United States Congress. And yet, nowhere within this testimony does Borman mention a word about the door only being able to open from the outside. In fact, in the newspapers printed at the time, it was stated that the astronauts could have opened the door themselves within 90 seconds. And during his testimony to Congress, Borman peddled that very claim. Mr. Weidler had asked, "The hatch that exists on the spacecraft would take 90 seconds to open from inside and to get out, is that right?" To which Borman replied, "Approximately." Why did Frank Borman tell Congress that the door could be opened from the inside, and then tell readers of his autobiography the exact opposite? Given that Frank Borman, the man in charge of dismantling the spacecraft, explicitly states that the door could not be opened from the inside, why did Jim Lovell, his co-pilot from Gemini 7 and Apollo 8, when sued by Bill Kaysing, claim the exact opposite during the interrogations? It seems that this externally locked hatch did not have to be. On page 186 of his book, Leap of Faith, Gordon Cooper writes,
Another piece of bad luck for Apollo 1. Its hatch took 14 different turns and other procedures to open up. In such an emergency, it was practically unusable. A new hatch had already been redesigned for greater safety, and this was to have been the last time the old hatch was used. As soon as Apollo 1 went into final rehab for its upcoming mission, the old hatch was scheduled to be replaced with a newer one, which could be opened within 20 seconds. The new hatch, which Apollo 1 would have flown with, probably would have saved Gus, Ed and Roger.
In the end, it took pad technicians 5 minutes to open this inward-opening 3-layer hatch. Given that Apollo 1 wasn't even supposed to fly with this clumsy door, why didn't NASA postpone the test until the proper hatch was installed? A hatch that was purposely designed to overcome the problems of its predecessor. Even if they couldn't wait until the safer hatch was installed, what was the untested one doing closed in the first place? For safety reasons, NASA had originally decided to leave it open during the test, but they changed plans at the last minute. As we are told, in the April 22nd, 1967 printing of the San Antonio Express-News, a man who helped manage spacecraft tests told a congressional subcommittee Friday that a decision was made last October 31st which may, in hindsight, have cost the lives of the Apollo 1 crew. The significance was, in fact, the closing of the hatch. The crew would not have been ingressed inside the spacecraft in the test under prior planning, said Donald Nichols, assistant test manager for NASA at the center. Nichols, who headed up the panel, which investigated the test procedures for NASA's Board of Review, said the level of desire to go through a closed-hatch launch day test was high. On October 31st, he said, a decision was made to change plans that would have kept the hatch opened until the crew had been better trained on emergency escape procedures. On that date, officials decided that the hatch would be locked with the crew inside during this test, and the emergency escape practice would not occur until after the test was over. Officials in defense of the decision have constantly stated that they felt the January 27th test, which killed Air Force Lieutenant Colonels Virgil I. Grissom, Edward H. White Jr., and Navy Lieutenant Commander Roger B. Chaffee, was not hazardous. But as we've demonstrated, NASA knew very well that the test was hazardous years before they made the decision to close the door. Gordon Cooper also says that this was the last time the old hatch was supposed to be used. True, but not only was it the last time in use, it was also the first time.
They had just put a hatch on there that took, I think, minutes to open up. And they never used it again. Isn't that strange? A new type hatch went on that day.
Note that Cooper states the new Apollo hatch could have been opened in 20 seconds. Keep that in mind for later. Although lying about what he told Congress about the hatch, Frank Borman does rightly say,
"My testimony was straight to the point. I said, basically, that we in the space program had overlooked the obvious hazard of putting a 100% oxygen environment into a spacecraft pressurized to more than 20 psi.
Indeed, that's what Borman stated during his testimony.
One of the guys who was on the investigation board, Frank Borman, didn't he have a PhD or something in thermodynamics?
Yeah, he did. And he didn't seem to know oxygen was highly, highly combustible. Now, how's that possible?